Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so just hang tight. We're just going to let the room fill in, so we'll get started shortly. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Hello, everyone. Thank you for those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to keep saying this message a couple of times. We're just waiting for the room to fill in, so just hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like, and we'll get started in about a minute or two. Thank you for those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We're just waiting for the room to fill in a bit, waiting for any late arrivals. We'll get started in about a minute or two. Okay. Great. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining our intro webinar on Tech Equity Collaborative today. I hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at Tech Equity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our supporters through some of our events and volunteer opportunities, and I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A box as we go, but we won't answer any of those until the end. And we will also be sending out a follow-up email afterwards with a link to the recording, a link to the presentation, and any links that I mentioned during the presentation. So don't worry if you miss anything, or if you'd like to share the presentation afterwards, or if you need to hop off early, the webinar is being recorded. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about why Tech Equity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address some of our most pressing economic issues. So we'll start with why we're here. Well, Tech Equity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers specifically were the cause of the problem. And so they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns, and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some solutions to some of these issues. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse, with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation, but at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate inequality in our region that our region was already experiencing. And so because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. So I have friends and family that are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them, their housing situations, their job situations, but also have friends and family who pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that further divides our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. So while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, like we just talked about, it's important to note that many in the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. The fact that rents are rising, I don't think is really a surprise to anyone on this call because we all know this, we feel this, we've heard this from friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have actually decreased slightly throughout the years. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based and that's where tech is headquartered, but a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. And just before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering around the 4% mark, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of about a month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. At TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it's not going to happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up. And we have to do so in partnership with those in our community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today and engaging in this conversation. Our goal at TechEquity Collaborative is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in this system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live through book clubs that we host, panel discussions, webinars such as these, voter guides that we produce around election season. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and economic equity. And a perfect example of that is our work on the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked in a coalition of legislators, people that were at risk of losing their apartments, people, and with other nonprofits in California. And together we were able to help pass the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through some of our corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. And as we mentioned, engaging tech workers is key. Tech workers have outsized political power that's been largely untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. Connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At TechEquity, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of our region's issues, these issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And as we just talked about, these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. While the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our own neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain that our community is feeling now during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the government instituted a policy that's still felt today especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So those on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image on the screen of San Francisco, it's all those red blocks all throughout the map. Those are redlined neighborhoods. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment or redlined didn't receive any investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. And that really is by no accident. These hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same neighborhoods and communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and across the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, two up and coming tech hubs. But as you can see, they also have a history of redlining. And once again, those are those red blocks, those red chunks around the map. Those are neighborhoods and communities that have been historically redlined. And so by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in redline neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be something like a huge rent increase, you suddenly lose your job, or your car breaks down and you have a huge bill that you have to pay. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 63% of African-American households in liquid asset poverty and 67% of Latino households in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the current pandemic because many people in our community were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we're not working on building the necessary solutions now. As we can see here in this chart, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement, aka unions, dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. While all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. So white men are earning more cents to the dollar. That's that orange bar on the left side of your screen, in comparison to black men and women, the blue bars on the right side of your screen. Because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that are providing good jobs. The cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford the average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom apartment working a regular 8-hour day, right? However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work. And this problem persists across the country, even though costs in up-and-coming tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as San Francisco. The cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone that is earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or in marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, and bus drivers who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. The state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA. That stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the two red bars on the left side of your screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that you just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. Because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates while folks with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, the orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco, and as they are being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's actually why that last blue bar on the bottom of the chart is increasing, because there isn't enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are equally as tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. And furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. A combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, lack of affordable housing production have created a crisis of displacement. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve these problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. But the good news is that we at TechEquity Collaborative and our members are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. But we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So what can we do? So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is the result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. We've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but it's clear that we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production, building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation, making sure we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the amount of housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from being displaced. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially embedded in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing, so we can craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic, like we've been talking about. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to communities they exist within, that people in surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits, regardless of the role you're in. We need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse workers, and contracted workers. In partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract work, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. In order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies: massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our safety social net so that no one falls through the cracks of our economy. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved. We host tons of educational and social events. So you can check out our events page to see some of the work we've been working on. If you're interested in public policy, you can support some of our 2022 priority legislation bills, which I'll be talking about soon. And you can also share your contracting in tech story if you were formerly a contractor, or if you ever been, through our contract worker disparity project. I'll also be talking about that soon. Or you can reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction to see how best you can engage with the organization. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved within these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So As I said, you can reply to the follow-up email. We'll connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but while building community in the process with each other. So this year's key initiatives and our focuses begins with the Contract Worker Disparity Project, which is really a first of its kind. It's a worker-centered initiative that sheds light on the practice of contracting out, proposes and advocates for public policy solutions, and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. So like I said, if you've ever been a contractor or know anyone that's formerly been a contractor and you'd like to share your story, there's an opportunity for that for this project. Next, we have the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which examines the promise and perils of housing technology. We aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past. Passing economic justice policy. So every year, TechEquity is introducing a bold policy agenda to address economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. Our priorities this year are housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance protections, and more. And finally, we have the System Reset Initiative, which helps tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. We're partnering with justice-involved people and organizations to get system reset into every tech company in California. So what can you do today? Well, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can sign up for a community conversation, which is really just an opportunity for you to chat one-on-one with myself and talk a little bit more about your journey at TechEquity. If you have more individual questions or would like to see and work on specific opportunities, it's a great way to get tapped into what we're working on and stay up to date. And finally, you can take action with us by becoming a Civic Tech volunteer. So we run Civic Tech projects. If you have skills, backend engineering, software engineering, user experience, there are projects that we're currently working on that if you want to donate a couple hours during the week to support, you can do that. Or you can support some of our priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So the first piece of priority legislation we have is the rental registry. So TechEquity is committed to getting better data on our housing market. Better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure help is being targeted to people who need it the most. TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that that data is being used fairly through our rent registry and algorithmic and bias in housing initiatives. So this year, we're helping run a bill, AB Assembly Bill 2469, authored by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks. So just make sure to subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack to stay updated on this bill and how you can participate and support as it moves through the California State Legislature. And next, we have the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act, also known as Senate Bill SB 1162, which would make pay equity reports public so that all workers have the information that they need to ensure that there is equal pay for equal work, and ensures that companies create a fair and equal playing field for all workers by, for example, posting the salaries in the job description and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So there are ways to support both of these bills. So just keep an eye out for more information on this. Like I said, if you're interested in this, you can sign up for a community conversation and I can point you one-on-one how you can support these bills, or you can just follow up on the email and ask what is available. But like I said, these are 2 key bills that we're working on this year that we're super excited to work and super excited to have any of you come join us and support as it moves through the California State Legislature. On events, we don't have any upcoming events at the moment, but we did just have an event yesterday on contract work, the gap in tech shadow workforce. So like I said, we were working on the contract worker disparity project, and we just had an event yesterday. State Senator Limon was actually on there talking about SB 1162, and we got to hear from contract workers themselves and break down a little bit of the bill. We have a recording of that panel discussion on our website right now, which I'll link in the follow-up email as well if you're interested. But Just keep an eye out on future events. We're always hosting webinars online on Thursdays from 12 to 1 p.m. So just keep an eye out on what we have coming up. So as I mentioned, we have, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. Tell a friend about our work, sign up for a community conversation, or let me know that you'd like to have a community conversation, or take action with us on our bills this year. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So if you have any questions right now, I'm happy to take some. A couple of them, like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email after this. So that'll have a link to the recording, that will have a link to the presentation slides. And it'll also have a link to a little bit of the things I talked about today. So I'll just take a couple minutes to see if anyone has any questions. And then if you think of a question later, it's okay. You can also just respond to the email and I can answer the question one-on-one as well. Cool. So I'm not seeing any questions. Totally fine. I just want to thank you all for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. I hope you all sign up for a community conversation if you get the chance, or just reach out to me, respond to that follow-up email, and I can point you in the right direction to see how you all can participate. So just thank you. Keep an eye out for that email and hope to see you soon. Thank you.